Welcome everyone, my name is Sophie and this is a user experience and design workshop for vhHacks. This is actually a re-recording of a live workshop presented at vhHacks 2021, and during that workshop I did a live demo of a website mockup, so that was recorded and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube and I'll link to it in the description below, so keep an eye out for that. Just a bit about myself. I'm currently studying software engineering at Waterloo, and I'm the director of marketing for vhHacks, so all the mascots and fish graphics you see are ones that I got to draw. And without further ado, let's get started. So let's start with some design principles, some magic ingredients to make your hack look great. So the first thing we're going to talk about is white space and alignment. And here I have a picture showing you some Gestalt principles. And Gestalt is actually a concept from psychology, which talks about how people visually perceive the world around them, and how groups of things tend to be perceived as greater than the sum of their parts. So, good figure, for example, shows how when things are together they make a shape, then you'll tend to perceive them as that shape, as that group. Proximity is when shapes are closer together, and you'll tend to perceive them as, again, part of a group, and so probably related to each other. In your application, for example, if you were to put related things closer to each other, then that's really going to help out your user in terms of figuring out intuitively how it works. But if you put unrelated things close to each other and related things farther apart, then that's really going to confuse your user. So keep that in mind. Similarity. You'll see here that we've got a row of circles, a row of triangles, and 2 rows of circles. So notice how I said that we've got 4 rows there, right? You would probably not describe this shape as 4 columns, each consisting of 1 circle, a triangle, then 2 circles, because you kind of group the similar objects together. So again, your user is going to perceive similar objects as being part of a larger group. Now for continuation, you probably saw that shape as an X, and not 2 lines that were very close to each other. So again, when things are overlapping, you're going to want to make sure they're meant to be seen as one thing rather than 2 unrelated things that happen to be way too close together. And closure there. You can see that those 3 three-quarter circles are making a square, and even though the square isn't actually there, it's created by the negative space, you still do perceive it as being there. So be mindful of the shapes and objects in your app or application or whatever. They might make shapes that you don't intend to be there, and that might be strange to the user or even inappropriate. But when done well, it can be really interesting. And finally, symmetry. Objects tend to be perceived as symmetrical shapes that form around their center. So if you're going to center things, by the way, you want to center them properly and think to yourself whether centering actually makes sense in this situation. For example, text, when you center it, can sometimes be a little bit harder to read actually, because then you've got jagged edges on both the left and the right side. So I would recommend for English text to left align your text. For example, if I were to put these bullet points all centered in the middle of the page, it would look really terrible because all the bullets would not line up with each other. So that's something to keep in mind. Now let's compare these 2 cards. So you can take a moment and think which one's more pleasing to look at. And hopefully by now you've paused the video and given it some thought. So I would say that the left one is more pleasing to me because there's more consistent spacing between the picture, the title element, the stars, and the description, and it doesn't really make sense to me to have the review grouped with the description visually, have them way too close together, right? So that's why I think the left one is more visually pleasing. Now, visual hierarchy is some way that you can emphasize important elements in your design. So scale has to do with relative size of your elements. So obviously bigger elements are going to be more noticeable, and your user is going to think that those are the most important ones. Contrast refers to the difference in values between elements, so darker ones are going to be more eye-catching if most of the rest of your page is lighter in color. Contrast, right, I already said that. Direction. Having elements in a different direction can be eye-catching, but try to use it sparingly because it can be kind of jarring if used too much or even at all. I visited a website recently where all of the text on the page was slanted at a 30-degree angle, and while that kind of was cool as a concept, it made the text really hard to read. So maybe reconsider, especially if you're going to have text that's oriented in a strange manner. And finally, position. People tend to read things top to bottom, left to right in the West, so make sure that you have your most important elements at the top of the page so that things are in an intuitive order, or alternatively the middle, depending on how your app is structured. Now we're going to talk a little bit about detail. Because while we've covered the general principles of design, how do we stand out? How do we be memorable to the user? So to me, that would be attention to detail. And I don't mean intricacy. You don't want to have everything be so detailed that it's confusing and people don't know what to pay attention to. I mean just like small bonuses that really delight the user when they're using your application. In game development, you might call that juice, I believe, or just something pleasing and small. For example, the Common App is a site that I use to apply to some universities, and when I submitted my application, there was a button that said celebrate, and once you clicked it, it would throw confetti on their screen, and I just thought that was really cute, and it was an unexpected kindness that made me happy at the time. This is a vhHacks marketing graphic. You can't see that currently. Let me move my face. There we go. You can see that Bob has a little hat on his head that's spinning, and this is because our graphics transitioned from being in the ocean to being in the sky, and the thing that's keeping Bob in the air is his propeller hat. And while it would have looked fine without the propeller hat, hopefully this made some people smile when they noticed the little detail there. Put my face back. And if you used an iPhone around 10 years ago, they followed a design philosophy called skeuomorphism, which was to make objects realistic. Not hyper-realistic, mind you, but just detailed enough to be familiar. So, like we've seen, detail can not only bring enjoyment, but make designs more intuitive and familiar to use. For example, just looking at this, you can definitely tell it's a bookshelf, and everything on it is a book. So you might think, well, to read a book, I'd probably click on it like I would pick up a book in real life. Recently, something that's come back into vogue is a design philosophy called neomorphism, which is sort of a cross between our more minimalist styles today and skeuomorphism. But I find that it's not very accessible because it's kind of low contrast. It requires like very subtle implications of protrusion to show where a button is. So I wouldn't so much recommend using that style unless you're making sure that things are high contrast enough to be seen. You can look it up, by the way. It's the skeuomorphism word, but with an N instead of an SK. Now let's talk about user experience. So here's an important UX acronym. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. You want to avoid overcomplicating your user interface, and in fact, you want to make it stupid easy to use. So you want to make scanning for information easy. On the right, you'll see a picture of our vhHacks Discord channels, and you'll notice that we've added icons to all the channels, so it's super easy to scan. And for example, if you have a question, you just look for the question mark. You don't need to bother to read all of the channel names to get to where you want to be. So you want to minimize the mental load of the user and let them be as lazy as possible. Otherwise, with our short attention spans these days, you might lose them before you actually get them to where they want to be or where you want them to be. So you'll notice these days there are a lot of one-page websites where you can keep scrolling to see all the information. You don't need to click things in the navigation bar. And often there's like one-click signups where the website is integrated with Google or with Facebook just so you can sign up right away and not have to go through filling in a form with your name and your username and your password again. And make sure, speaking of forms, that you always pick the right input type. For example, if there's more than one choice, have checkboxes. If there's only one choice, have radios, just to make things easier for the user. And here I've written hover state. This is actually an important part of making things intuitive. When you hover over something that's clickable, you expect your cursor to change into a pointer, like the finger icon. So that's something you can do with CSS, and that makes it super intuitive to the user that, oh, this is something you can click. And if they don't see that, they probably won't think that you can click it. So it's a small thing that you might not notice, but definitely important. And here I've added a link to userinyourface.com, which you can check out later. It's an example, a really funny and exaggerated example, but of things that you definitely should not do in user interface design. So I'll leave that to you to check out. So let's compare these two pizza cards. And which one do you think emphasizes the most important information? And what information do you think is the most important information on this card? So for this one, I would probably go with the one on the left because, well, first of all, I think the type of pizza is really important because that's probably the only thing differentiating all these pizza cards from each other, that and the price. So I can see that both these things are bolded, and the less important information, the weight of the pizza and the type of pastry it's using, they've made it smaller and a lighter gray, so it's less distracting to the user. Whereas on the right side, it's almost the same font size as the title, so it's really a lot of information that the user feels like they have to look at. Next slide. And let's think about these two country select buttons. Which one do you think is better to use? So hopefully you've given it some thought. In my opinion, B is easier to scan because colors are eye-catching as are pictures, and this makes it easier for someone to find the country that they want. In addition, it's got that search feature, which is far more convenient than having to scroll through all of the countries on the left. Right, actually, I think those are languages. I'm not sure why it says select country. I didn't make this, by the way. But someone mentioned to me the other day that A actually might be the more performant choice because you don't have to load hundreds of images for the one on the right. But I think having the search is a nice compromise for the two. All right, so I think an important part of user experience is storytelling. So you want to tell the user who you are, what you're offering, and what you want them to do next. And also, what is your brand or application's personality? So you should go ahead and pick a color palette and tone and stick with it. Be consistent throughout your marketing and your website and everything to do with your application. And this familiarity for the user is going to minimize any confusion they might have if you suddenly decide to change your style. If you have one page on your website that's completely different in color and tone and font and whatnot than the rest of it, they're going to be very confused. So remember to keep that in mind. This is a website I used recently called Toggle. It's a great productivity tool, and you'll see that the colors are consistent throughout the whole application. They all kind of mesh with each other. And while I'm not going to be covering color theory in this workshop, which is a whole nother can of worms, I will be linking some palette resources at the end, and there are lots of great resources out there if you want to learn how to pick great colors. This is also from Toggle, and you can see that their graphics are also consistent. Like the spider and the boxes, those are really cute 3D models. They're kind of whimsical, and all of their kind of like empty pages, 404 pages, things like that, all have cute graphics like that. So it's really pleasing to the eye and consistent throughout the whole thing. In the middle, you can see that when you're picking a color for a project in Toggle, you're only allowed to select from a list of colors that kind of mesh with the rest of the application. So I thought that was a really clever way to make sure no matter what you did in the application, it all looked cohesive and on brand. So yeah, consider doing that. Some more points about storytelling. You want to, as soon as your user lands on your website, as soon as they open your app, you want to welcome them and kind of guide them on a very intuitive journey. You want to direct them to where they want to go, or where you want to go, where you want them to go, because sometimes they don't know, and so you want to make your main features easy, intuitive to find and access. So if you have an application whose function is, for example, a drawing app, then you want to make the brushes really easy to find, the eraser super easy to find. And if you're selling something on your website, then you want to direct them to your most popular offerings, like the shop, for example, or the map or the subscribe button, right? And just make sure their journey is smooth. They shouldn't have to hunt around for what they're looking for. So this is an example of hotels.ng, which is a Nigerian hotel site. So you can pause the video here and think about things you like about this homepage and things you don't like. So hopefully you've given that some time. I'm going to start with things I don't like about this website. So first of all, I don't like how the heading is kind of hard to read because the background is rather high contrast right behind the heading. So that's something I see a lot, where the image is too distracting for the words on top, which makes it difficult to parse. So be mindful when you're picking images for your websites. Other than that, I really like how once you land on their page, you see find and book hotels in Nigeria. It's very clear and you know exactly what they do here. And then the next thing says search through 10,000 hotels in Nigeria, which is kind of like an imperative command, right? It's telling you do this next. So you're like, okay, I will search for a city or a particular hotel. And that search bar is right there. It's right under the subtitle. And then the next two details, you enter a check-in, check-out, and then you have your Find Hotels button, which is easy to find. It's right there. I might put the Find Hotels button under the search bar, just so the whole thing isn't quite so wide, but that's just personal preference. All right, now let's talk about accessibility. So you want to make sure that your application is usable by as many people as possible. So the graphic on the right is from Microsoft's Inclusive Development Package, and so that gives you a lot of examples of different types of disabilities that your users might be experiencing. And you should absolutely take these into account when designing any application. I'll move my face again so you can see the one on the bottom right. There we go. And so this is a really, really brief coverage of this topic. You should definitely look more into it. There will be links and resources. But some things that you can do to improve accessibility in your applications include making sure that things are visible or usable in the tab order, which is when you're tabbing through the elements on your page. You should be able to tab to any input so that you can type in it. You should be able to tab to any button so that you can press enter to use it, because not everyone is going to be able to use a mouse. Screen readers. So some people are not able to see images on the screen, so then you might want to have alt text, which is text that is read aloud, I believe, by screen readers when in place of an image that describes the content of the image, and captions for videos and etc. for people who might not be able to hear the video content. To add on to that, an important thing you should do is to not rely on color to differentiate elements. For example, when I'm filling out a form, and I see this a lot, often when some input is invalid, like for example, the password doesn't have enough characters or something, then all the form will do is show some red text, really small red text above that input. And to me, that's first of all really hard for any user to find and identify what went wrong with their submission. And also, if you're colorblind, that red text might look like black text to you, so it's going to be near impossible for you to find what went wrong with your form input, right? So instead of just using color, you might also want to use symbols, like put an X, a very visible X next to that form element. You might also want to make it bolder, so a larger font weight, and you can use font size, font weight, typeface, which is kind of like font and contrast and many more things to differentiate the things that you want the user to notice. Again, this was not nearly a comprehensive coverage of accessibility elements, so I encourage you to do your own research. Next slide. So I have a note here about the curb cut effect, which was really interesting to me because in the 1940s in Michigan, they decided to make all the sidewalks usable for wheelchair users. And so if you have a sloped curb like that, then anyone who's using wheels to get around is going to be able to use it. So that's just an interesting note about how when you start making things accessible, then you might actually end up benefiting everyone. And so it's definitely just not a consideration for people who might be differently abled. And I don't have visuals for this, but I wanted to make a short note about dark mode because that also seems to be something that is getting increasingly popular, to make a dark mode for your website. And the thing about dark mode is that you can't just invert all the colors and call it a day. Well, maybe not invert, but make a lighter version and put them on a black background. I read an article recently about how hard it is to actually design a good dark mode because, well, first of all, you don't want it to be too hard on the eyes. The whole point of dark mode is so it's easier on the eyes, right? So doing what you think dark mode might be, which is a black background with white text, is actually really, really difficult to read. So you actually want a dark gray and slightly less than completely bright white text. So that would be like a light gray. And for things that aren't text or backgrounds, you'll actually need to change the colors of nearly everything in your application. For example, if your button was originally a blue or a bright blue, a dark blue, you'll probably need to change it to a less saturated and brighter blue in dark mode. And you need to be really careful about the colors you're using to show calls to action and hierarchy, because things that are normally dark in light mode are pastel or less saturated in dark mode. And I just encourage you to read more about that. Cool. So at this point in the live workshop, I challenged everyone to a Figma exercise. So Figma is a design application that is, as far as I know, the industry standard, maybe up there with Sketch for Mac. And it's used by user interface designers to kind of do mock-ups for websites and applications and show the developers what they think the website should look like. So you can go to figma.com to use Figma. It's completely free. And yeah, the challenge that I gave to the workshop participants was to design a website or an app landing page for a donut store. And so I did this live, as I mentioned previously, and I will be uploading that video separately. There's some audio in the background that hopefully it won't get taken down for. And just a disclaimer that I used to use a lot of Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator for my mockups, so I was completely unfamiliar with Figma in that live demo, so I was learning along with everyone else. But hopefully you go check that one out and you enjoy it. Right, next slide. So here are some resources. There will be a link to the slides in the description where you can actually click these links. So Microsoft Inclusive Design, that's for accessibility related resources. There's definitely more inclusive design resources out there that you should definitely search for. I kind of just included one of each. I do follow quite a few Instagram pages that have helped me with my UX, so that would be Interfacely and UXL. Figma themselves, they have design lessons, so you can go look at that on their website. And if you have trouble, if you're not an artist, for example, if you have trouble picking nice colors, then there's plenty of hand-curated color palettes out there. So on colorhunt.co, color.adobe.com/explore also has some really cool palettes. I think several of them are based on images, so that's another strategy that you'll see me using in my demo later on, where I pick some colors from an image to make up my UI. If you have any questions about my workshop, feel free to find me on Discord in our vhHacks Discord server, which will also be linked below, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening to this workshop. It was a pleasure to put together and to give to y'all, and I hope to see you next time.